I just faced my own worst nightmare. The HOA president's son just turned my lake cabin into Party Central and completely trashed it. And his excuse? He insisted some community rotation rule gave him full rights to my property. The funny thing is, the only thing that got rotated that day was the 8 squad cars circling my dock. Let me start from the beginning. My name's Ethan Cole, and the first time Greg tried to put his hands on me, it was over a lawn flamingo. Not a whole flock of them, mind you, just one. A single, plastic, pink bird my wife, Clara, had named Bartholomew. Greg was a big man, built like a refrigerator that had been left out in the rain, puffy and rusted around the edges. He was the husband of Diane Fitzgerald, the president of our homeowners association. If Diane was the evil queen of our little neighborhood, Greg was her angry, silent troll. He lumbered onto my lawn, his face the color of a ripe plum. He pointed a thick finger at Bartholomew, who was standing proudly next to our prize-winning petunias. "That's a violation," Greg grunted. His voice sounded like gravel in a blender. I was watering those petunias. I set the hose down and smiled. I've learned a smile can be a weapon. It confuses people who expect you to be angry or scared. "Good morning to you, too, Greg. Is it a violation of good taste or one of Diane's special rules?" His eyes narrowed. "You know the rules. No lawn ornaments. Diane sent you 3 letters." "Oh, I got the letters," I said, keeping my tone light and friendly. "I also read the bylaws, all 212 pages of them, including the section on holiday decorations, which are allowed for up to 30 days. And since every day with Bartholomew is a holiday, I figure I'm in the clear." I gave him another big, cheerful smile. This was not the answer he was expecting. Trolls don't do well with logic. They prefer grunting and pointing. He took a step closer, puffing out his chest. He was trying to use his size to scare me. It was a classic bully move. "You think you're smart, don't you?" "My wife tells me I am." My dog seems to agree. "The jury's still out on my cat," I said. "Look, Greg, it's a plastic bird. There are bigger problems in the world. For example, your shirt is on inside out." He glanced down at his shirt. It wasn't. But in that split second of confusion, I saw the real Greg, the man behind the muscle. He was just a follower, an enforcer. He was angry because I wasn't falling in line. He balled his fists. "You're going to move the bird." "Now, I don't think I will," I said, my smile finally fading. My voice dropped a little. It became calm and very, very clear. "This is my property. You are on it. The bird stays. You, however, should probably leave." He took another step, so he was right in my personal space. I could smell the cheap coffee on his breath. "Or what?" he snarled. I didn't move a muscle. I just looked him straight in the eye. "Or I'll turn this hose on you, and then I'll call the police and report that my strange, angry neighbor is on my lawn, threatening me over a flamingo. I wonder who they'll believe. The guy calmly watering his flowers, or the big, red-faced man yelling about a plastic bird?" For a long moment, we just stood there. It was a standoff. Man versus troll. My secret weapon wasn't the hose. It was the fact that I am incredibly, deeply, fundamentally stubborn. I don't give in when I know I'm right. And I knew I was right about this. It was about more than a bird. It was about a man's right to have a ridiculous pink flamingo on his own lawn. Greg's face twisted. He wanted to push me. I could see it in his eyes. But he also had a tiny little seed of doubt. He knew I wasn't afraid of him. He knew I would do exactly what I said. He finally let out a frustrated sound, a puff of angry air. He turned, stomped off my lawn, and marched back to his own house. As he went, he shouted over his shoulder, "This isn't over. Diane will hear about this." I picked up the hose again and gave Bartholomew a gentle spray of water, washing a speck of dust off his beak. "You heard the man, Bartholomew," I said quietly. "The queen is coming." That fight over Bartholomew was just the opening salvo in a 2-year war I never saw coming. My wife, Clara, opened the front door. She was holding a cup of coffee, a smart, knowing look on her face. She had been watching the whole time. "You handled that well," she said. "But he's right. This is just the beginning." I nodded, looking at the perfect green lawns and identical mailboxes that lined our street. It looked like a peaceful place, a quiet suburban dream. But I knew it was a kingdom ruled by a tyrant with a binder full of rules. And I had just poked the dragon. Now I had to be prepared for the fire because I knew deep down that Diane wasn't just going to send another letter. She was going to send her troll back. And next time, he might not be so easy to scare off. My wife, Clara, and I bought our house in this neighborhood for one reason: peace. We wanted a quiet street, a nice yard for our dog, and neighbors who waved when you drove by. For the first year, That's exactly what we got. It was perfect. We'd sit on our back deck in the evenings, listening to the crickets, and think, we made it. We found our little slice of heaven. But heaven, it turned out, had a homeowners association. And that HOA was run by Diane Fitzgerald. We first met her at the annual neighborhood barbecue. She had a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Her hair was perfect. Her clothes were perfect. Her handshake felt like a threat. She walked around with a clipboard, making notes. I saw her write something down while looking at the Webster's new swing set. The next week, the Websters got a notice that the swing set was not an approved color. It had to be beige. Everything in Diane's world had to be beige. She was the president of the HOA, a position she held with the sort of grim determination usually reserved for dictators of small countries. Her husband, Greg, was her silent partner. He stood behind her at meetings, arms crossed, glaring at anyone who dared to ask a question. They were a team, the iron fist and the clenched fist. Our first taste of her power was a letter about our trash cans. We had left them by the curb an hour too long after the truck had come. The letter was formal and cold. It quoted bylaw number 74, subsection C. It came with a $50 fine. I thought it was ridiculous. Clara, who is smarter and more patient than I am, just said, let's pay it. It's not worth the fight. So we did. We learned to pull our trash cans in the moment the truck turned the corner. Then came the letter about the length of our grass. It was 1/4 of an inch too high. Another $50 fine. Then a notice about a crack in our driveway, a tiny little thing you could barely see. The notice said we had 30 days to have the entire driveway repaved, or we'd face a fine of $100 per day. That was when I started to get angry. This wasn't about keeping the neighborhood nice. This was about power. It was about her need to control every little thing. I started talking to some of the other neighbors. Quietly, of course. You didn't talk about Diane out in the open. I spoke to Mr. Peterson, an old man who had lived here for 30 years. He told me he'd been fined because his garden hose wasn't coiled correctly. I talked to the young couple across the street. They were forced to dig up a beautiful rose garden because Diane had decided roses were not on the approved list of plants. Everyone had a story. Everyone was afraid of her. They just paid the fines and kept their heads down. The only person who didn't seem afraid was Old Man Silas. He wasn't really anyone's uncle. He was just one of those old, eccentric guys that every neighborhood has. He wore mismatched socks and a fishing hat, even when he was just getting his mail. He told me once that he was a retired pigeon fancier. He spent his days on his porch, watching the world go by. He saw everything. When I mentioned Diane to him, he just winked. She's a storm cloud, son, he'd said. Best to have a good umbrella. It was strange advice, but with Old Man Silas, you learned to expect the strange. Life became a game of avoiding Diane's wrath. We measured our grass. We coiled our hose perfectly. We made sure our mailbox was always perfectly straight. We were living in a state of low-grade fear. The peace we had moved here for was gone. It had been replaced by a constant, nagging worry. What would she find next? What new rule would she invent to make our lives difficult? Clara tried to keep me calm. It's just a neighborhood, Ethan, she'd say. Let's not let her ruin it for us. But it was already ruined. You can't enjoy your home when you feel like you're living in a prison camp run by a smiling tyrant. The breaking point, the thing that started the real war, wasn't a fine. It was the Flamingo, Bartholomew. Clara saw him at a garage sale and fell in love. He was bright pink and utterly ridiculous. She put him in the flower bed as a joke. It was our little act of rebellion, a tiny splash of color in a world of beige. We knew we'd get a letter. We were prepared for that, but we weren't prepared for what came next. We weren't prepared for Greg on our lawn or the open declaration of war that followed. And we certainly weren't prepared for the next letter that showed up in our mailbox. A letter so outrageous, so completely insane, that it made a fine for a plastic bird look like a friendly greeting. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was in the usual crisp, white envelope with the HOA logo embossed in gold. It looked important, official. I had a bad feeling before I even opened it. My stomach did a little flip. Living under Diane's rule was like that. You learned to fear the mailman. I took a deep breath, tore it open, and read it. Then I read it again, because I was sure I had misunderstood. It wasn't a fine. It was worse. It was a notice of landscape noncompliance and mandatory remediation. That was a lot of big words to say something very simple. Diane didn't like our tree. We had a beautiful big oak tree in our front yard. It was probably older than the neighborhood itself. It provided shade. Birds nested in its branches. It was the best thing about our yard. According to the letter, The tree's roots were potentially threatening the integrity of the public sidewalk. It cited a bylaw I had never heard of, one that gave the HOA board the power to remove any plant life they deemed a potential hazard. The letter informed us that we had 14 days to have the tree professionally removed at our own expense, of course. If we failed to comply, the HOA would hire their own company to do it and bill us for the cost, along with a hefty fine for noncompliance. I felt a surge of hot, white anger. This was insane. It was a healthy, beautiful tree. There was nothing wrong with the sidewalk. I went outside and checked. It was perfectly flat. Clara came home from work and found me staring at the tree, the letter crumpled in my fist. I showed it to her. Her face went pale. "She can't do that," Clara said, her voice a whisper. "Can she?" "According to this, she can," I said, my voice tight. "She's the queen. She can do whatever she wants." This was different from the trash cans or the grass. This was personal. This was our tree. Clara had loved that tree since the day we moved in. It felt like Diane was reaching right into our home, right into our lives, and trying to rip something beautiful out. Clara, ever the practical one, said, "Okay, let's not panic. There's an HOA meeting next week. We'll go. We'll talk to her. We'll explain. We can get an expert to look at the tree and write a report. We'll be reasonable." I didn't have much faith in reason, not when it came to Diane, but I agreed to try. We hired an arborist, a man who knows trees. He came out, looked at our oak, and laughed. He said it was one of the healthiest trees in the county. He wrote up a detailed report, complete with photos, stating that the roots posed no threat to the sidewalk whatsoever. We went to the HOA meeting armed with our report. The meeting was held in the little community clubhouse. It was a small, sad room with folding chairs and bad coffee. Diane sat at a long table at the front, with Greg standing behind her like a guard dog. A few other neighbors were there, looking miserable. When the time for resident concerns came, I stood up. I spoke calmly. I explained the situation. I presented the arborist's report. I showed them the pictures. I thought, for a foolish moment, that this would be the end of it, that logic and facts would win. Diane listened with that fake, patient smile on her face. When I was done, she didn't even look at the report I held out to her. She just looked at me, her eyes cold and hard. "Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Cole," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. "However, the board has already made its decision. The bylaw is very clear. The tree is a potential hazard. The notice stands." I was stunned, but it's not a hazard. I have an expert report right here that says so. "We don't recognize outside reports," she said smoothly. "The board has its own experts." "Who are they?" I demanded. "Let me see their report." Her smile widened. It was a predator's smile. "That information is confidential. The decision is final. Now, if there are no other legitimate concerns, we can move on." She looked around the room, daring anyone else to speak. No one did. They just stared at their hands. They were all too scared. I felt a hot flush of shame and anger. She had done it in public. She had humiliated me. She had made it clear that facts didn't matter. Rules didn't matter. All that mattered was her power. I looked at Clara. Her face was set, her eyes burning. We walked out of that meeting without another word. The air outside was cool, but I felt like I was on fire. As we walked home, past the perfect lawns and the beige houses, I knew Clara had been wrong. This was not a time for reason. This was a time for war. Diane had made a powerful enemy that night. She just didn't know it yet. She thought she had beaten me. She thought I would give up and cut down my tree. But I am stubborn. And when you back a stubborn man into a corner, he doesn't cower. He starts looking for a way to tear the whole corner down. The war started quietly. It wasn't fought with angry words or lawn ornaments. It was fought with paper. I am a methodical man. I like details. I like spreadsheets. And I decided to learn everything there was to know about our HOA. I sent a formal, written request to Diane for a complete copy of the HOA's financial records for the past 5 years. It was my right as a homeowner. I knew she couldn't legally refuse. Her response was a masterclass in passive aggression. She didn't deny my request. She just made it as difficult as possible. A week later, a large, heavy box was dropped on my doorstep. It was filled with thousands of pages of loose paper, receipts, bank statements, invoices. None of it was organized. It was just a giant, chaotic pile of information. It was meant to be overwhelming. It was meant to make me give up. It was a mistake. She had just handed her enemy all the ammunition he would ever need. For the next 2 weeks, my dining room table disappeared under a mountain of paper. Every night after work, Clara and I would sit there with highlighters and notebooks. She would sort the papers into piles by date, and I would enter every single transaction into a massive spreadsheet I had designed. It was slow, boring work, but bit by bit, a picture began to emerge. The numbers didn't add up. There were payments to companies I had never heard of. A company called Evergreen Landscaping was being paid a fortune, far more than it should cost to mow the little patches of grass in the common areas. There were huge bills for legal consulting and administrative fees. It smelled bad. It smelled like stolen money. Meanwhile, Diane was turning up the heat. We started getting notices for everything. A tiny oil spot on our driveway from a visitor's car, a weed in a flower bed, our house number, which was apparently the wrong font. Each notice was another piece of paper, another threat. It was harassment, pure and simple. One morning, we woke up to find our trash cans gone, just vanished. We had to buy new ones. Another morning, there was a dead bird on our welcome mat. It was a clear, ugly message, back off. I started talking to the neighbors again, but this time I had something to show them. I showed Mr. Peterson the landscaping bills. He was a retired accountant. His eyes lit up with a familiar, angry fire. "This is outrageous," he whispered, looking over his shoulder as if Diane might be listening. "We're being robbed." But most people were still too afraid. They would listen. They would nod. But when I asked them to sign a petition or come to a meeting, they would shake their heads. "I'm sorry, Ethan," they'd say. "I can't. I have kids. I don't want any trouble." Diane and Greg had created a kingdom of fear, and it was working. Only old man Silas seemed unfazed. I'd see him on his porch, watching me go door to door. One afternoon, he called me over. He was cleaning out one of his pigeon coops. "You're stirring the pot, son," he said, not looking at me. "That's good. Sometimes a pot needs stirring." "It's not doing any good," I said, frustrated. "Everyone is too scared to help." He finally stopped what he was doing and looked at me. His eyes were surprisingly sharp and intelligent. "Fear is a lock," he said. "But every lock has a key. You're looking for the key in those papers, but sometimes the key is somewhere else." He then went back to his pigeons, leaving me to wonder what on earth he meant. That night, I found it. It was a small thing, a single invoice from Evergreen Landscaping. At the bottom, there was a handwritten note for the Fitzgerald property. The Fitzgeralds were Diane and Greg. The HOA was paying for their personal landscaping. It was the first solid, undeniable piece of proof. It was theft. I held the invoice in my hand, my heart pounding. This was it. This was the thread I could pull that might unravel everything. It wasn't just about a tree anymore. It was about fraud. It was about a crime. I had the proof. But as I looked out my window at Diane's house, with its perfectly manicured, HOA-funded lawn, I had a chilling thought. What would a person who was willing to steal from all her neighbors do to someone who was about to expose her? Old man Silas was right. I had been looking for a key in the papers. But maybe the real key was understanding just how dangerous the people I was fighting truly were. I decided to be direct. It was probably a mistake, but I was riding a wave of righteous anger. I had the invoice, the smoking gun. I thought if I confronted them, they might back down. I thought the shame of being caught would be enough. I was wrong. I was so wrong. I chose my moment carefully. I waited until I saw Diane leave the house one afternoon, leaving Greg at home alone. I didn't want to deal with her smug, smiling face. I thought I could handle Greg. I thought he was just the muscle, the dumb troll who followed orders. Another mistake. I walked across the street, the invoice folded neatly in my pocket. I rang their doorbell. Greg answered, looking surprised to see me. He was holding a wrench. He looked like he'd been working on something. "Greg," I said, keeping my voice level. "I need to talk to you." He just grunted, blocking the doorway. "We got nothing to talk about." "I think we do," I said. I pulled the invoice out of my pocket and held it up for him to see. "I've been going through the HOA financials. I found this. It's an invoice from Evergreen Landscaping. It's for work done on your property, but the HOA paid for it." I expected him to get defensive, to deny it. He didn't. He just looked at the paper. Then he looked at me. And for the first time, I saw something in his eyes besides dull anger. I saw a flicker of cold, hard intelligence. He wasn't a dumb troll. He was something else entirely. He slowly wiped his greasy hands on a rag. He didn't speak for a long moment. The silence was heavy, threatening. Then he said, his voice quiet and low, "You've been busy. You've been stealing." I shot back. "You and Diane, you've been stealing from all of us." He took a step forward, and I instinctively took a step back. He was no longer in the doorway. He was on the porch with me. He was still holding the wrench. He tapped it lightly against his palm. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was menacing. "You're a smart guy, Ethan," he said, his voice dangerously calm. But you're not as smart as you think you are. You're meddling in things you don't understand. I understand theft, I said, my own voice wavering just a little. I understand fraud, and I think the district attorney will understand it, too. That's when he dropped the act. The whole quiet, menacing thing disappeared. His face hardened into a mask of pure rage. He lunged forward and grabbed the front of my shirt, slamming me back against a porch column. The wrench clattered to the ground. He didn't need it. His hands were strong enough. You listen to me, he snarled, his face inches from mine. You're going to forget all about that piece of paper. You're going to stop digging. You're going to stop talking to the neighbors. You're going to cut down your stupid tree, and you're going to keep your mouth shut. This is your only warning. My heart was hammering in my chest. This was not a fight about rules anymore. This was real. This was violent. Or what? I choked out, my voice barely a whisper. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. Or your pretty wife, Clara. She's a teacher, right? Drives that little blue car to work every day. It would be a shame if something happened to her. An accident. Brakes fail. You understand me. A cold dread washed over me that was far worse than fear for myself. He had threatened Clara. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He was threatening my family, my wife, the person I was sworn to protect. This wasn't about a tree or money or rules. This was about evil. Pure, simple evil. He held me there for a second longer, making sure his message had sunk in. Then he shoved me away. I stumbled backward, catching my balance on the railing. I was breathing hard, shaken to my core. He picked up his wrench, gave me one last cold look, and went back inside, shutting the door behind him. I stood there on his porch for a long time, the invoice still clutched in my hand. It felt worthless now. The game had changed. The stakes were no longer financial. They were life and death. I walked back to my house on trembling legs. When Clara came home, she saw my face and knew instantly that something was terribly wrong. I told her everything. I told her about Greg's threat. I saw the fear in her eyes, and it broke my heart. That night, we sat in our living room in the dark, the curtains drawn. For the first time, I considered giving up. I considered cutting down the tree, burning the papers, and just surviving. Was a neighborhood worth risking Clara's life? That question echoed in the silent house. How far was I willing to go to defend what was mine? We didn't sleep that night. We just sat on the couch, the lights off, talking in hushed voices. The threat against Clara hung in the air between us, heavy and toxic. Every creak of the house made us jump. Every car that drove by sent a jolt of fear through me. Greg had succeeded. He had terrified us. Maybe we should just move, Clara said, her voice small. We can sell the house. Just walk away. It's not worth it, Ethan. I looked at her. I saw the fear in her eyes, but underneath it, I saw something else. I saw the same stubborn fire that burned in me. She didn't really want to run. She was testing me. She was asking me what we were going to do. The core question of our lives had just been laid bare on our coffee table. How far will a man go to defend his own? Running away wasn't defending anything. It was surrendering. No, I said, my voice quiet but firm. We're not moving. A small, sad smile touched her lips. I was hoping you'd say that. This is our home. I continued, feeling a new kind of resolve hardening inside me. It wasn't angry anymore. It was cold. It was methodical. We built a life here. We planted those petunias. We loved that stupid, ugly tree. And no one, especially not a thug like Greg and a tyrant like Diane, is going to threaten our family and chase us out of our own home. Not now. Not ever. This was the turning point. The fear was still there, but it was no longer in charge. Purpose was in charge. Now, this was no longer a squabble with the HOA. This was a mission. We weren't just going to expose them. We were going to dismantle their entire kingdom. We were going to take them down so hard they would never be able to hurt anyone else again. Okay, Clara said, her voice stronger now. So what's the plan, strategist? The plan, I said, is to stop playing their game. We're not going to fight them with bylaws and petitions anymore. We're going to fight them with the truth. But we need more than one invoice. We need overwhelming proof. We need something they can't escape. We talked for hours, mapping out a strategy. We were a team, my stubborn, methodical mind and her sharp, practical intelligence. We needed more evidence. We needed more allies. And we needed to be smarter, quieter, and more careful than ever before. The next day, I went to see old man Silas. I found him on his porch as usual, watching his pigeons circle in the sky. I told him everything. I told him about the invoice, about the confrontation with Greg, and about the threat against Clara. I didn't leave anything out. He listened patiently, his face unreadable behind his sunglasses. When I was finished, he just nodded slowly. I was wondering when he'd show his true colors, he said calmly. Greg's got a temper and a police record from back in his younger days. Assault, intimidation. He's not just a bully, son. He's a criminal. I need help, Silas, I said. I need to find a way to get definitive proof, something that will put them away. A slow grin spread across his face. It was the first time I had ever seen him look truly happy. Help, he said, is my middle name. Well, actually, it's Eugene, but help sounds better. He leaned forward in his rocking chair, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Diane keeps everything in her home office. The real books, not the garbage she gave you. She has a ledger, a little black book where she keeps track of all the real numbers, the bribes, the kickbacks, the money they're laundering. If you can get that book, you've got them. How am I supposed to do that, Silas? I asked. Break into her house. He chuckled. Don't be silly. You can't just break in. You need a plan. You need a distraction. You need a field operation. He looked up at his pigeons, who were now landing one by one on the roof of his coop. A strange, excited glint appeared in his eye. And lucky for you, he said, winking at me. I'm an expert in distractions. I had no idea what he meant. I had no idea what kind of plan a retired pigeon fancier could possibly cook up. But as I walked away from his house that day, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. We had a target, the Black Ledger. We had a mission. And we had a secret weapon. Although, I was pretty sure our secret weapon was more than a little bit crazy. The moral crossroads was behind us. We had chosen our path. Now, we just had to walk it and pray it didn't lead us off a cliff. The plan, as old man Silas laid it out, was completely insane. It was also brilliant. He called it Operation Feathered Fury. The goal was simple. Get Diane and Greg out of their house for at least 20 minutes so I could get in, find the ledger, and get out. The method was anything but simple. Silas, it turned out, knew the schedules of everyone on our street. He knew that on Thursday afternoons, Diane attended a yoga class and Greg went to the gym. This gave us a window of about 90 minutes when their house was empty. The problem was their security system. It was a top-of-the-line model, complete with cameras and motion sensors. That's where Clara came in. Clara wasn't just smart. She was a tech geek. Before she became a teacher, she worked for a software company. She spent 2 days researching their specific security system online. She found a flaw, a tiny loophole in the code that could allow someone to create a maintenance window, a 10-minute period where the system would temporarily disable itself without logging an error. I can do it, she told me, her eyes shining with excitement. I can create the window, but I have to be close to their house to access their wireless network, and I'll only be able to do it once. You'll have exactly 10 minutes to get in and out. So, we had a window, and we had a way to bypass the alarm, but we still needed a distraction. What if one of them came home early? We needed to make sure the entire neighborhood was looking somewhere else. That was Silas's department. Leave that to me, he said with a mysterious smile. Just be ready on Thursday at 2 o'clock. Thursday came. I was a nervous wreck. My palms were sweating. My heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. This was crazy. We were about to commit breaking and entering. But the image of Greg's face snarling at me, the memory of his threat against Clara, pushed me forward. This was the only way. At 1:45, Clara walked down the street, pretending to be on a phone call. She sat on a park bench that was just within range of the Fitzgerald's Wi-Fi, her laptop hidden in a tote bag. I was hiding in the bushes between our houses, dressed in dark clothes, my heart pounding in my ears. Old man Silas was on his porch, calmly sipping a glass of iced tea. At exactly 2 o'clock, Silas stood up. He pulled a small, silver whistle from his pocket and blew it. It didn't make a sound that I could hear, but high above, something changed. His flock of pigeons, which had been circling lazily, suddenly formed a tight, organized group. They began to fly with purpose. Then the chaos began. Silas had spent the last week secretly scattering a special, high-energy birdseed on the roof of the house directly across the street from Diane's. The house belonged to the one person Diane disliked more than me, a woman who had once nominated someone else for HOA president. The pigeons descended. It wasn't just a few birds. It was a storm. Hundreds of them. They swarmed the roof, cooing, flapping, and making an incredible racket. It was, as Silas had promised, a feathered fury. People came out of their houses, staring at the unbelievable sight. It was a pigeon apocalypse. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Clara. Go. Clock is ticking. 10 minutes. I took a deep breath and ran. I vaulted the low fence into Diane's backyard. The back door was my entry point. I pulled on a pair of gloves. The lock was simple. I had practiced on a similar one at home. It clicked open in under 30 seconds. I was in. The house was silent, sterile, and beige. It smelled like air freshener and unhappiness. I moved quickly, heading straight for the office. It was exactly where Silas said it would be. The room was immaculate. A large desk, a fancy computer, and a wall of filing cabinets. I started searching. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clear. I looked for a safe, a locked drawer, anything. I found it in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, hidden behind a stack of boring files labeled warranties. It was a simple, black, leather-bound book, the ledger. I opened it. It was all there. Page after page of handwritten notes, names, dates, amounts of money, the landscaping kickbacks, the phony legal fees. It was a confession in neat, tidy handwriting. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures, page by page. My hands were trembling so badly I had to take each shot twice. My phone buzzed again. 2 minutes left. I finished the last page, shoved the ledger back in the drawer, and closed it. I was about to stand up when I heard it. A phone was ringing. It wasn't my phone. It was coming from the desk. A second cell phone, a burner phone, was tucked away under some papers. On instinct, I hit the button to answer and held it to my ear, staying silent. It was Diane's voice. She sounded agitated. "It's done," she said. "The final offer has been made on the Silas property. He'll be getting the foreclosure notice next week. The developer is very pleased." My blood ran cold. They were going after old man Silas. That was their next move. But it was the next sentence she said that made the floor drop out from under me. "Once he's gone," Diane said, her voice like ice, "we can finally start the demolition. Greg has already taken care of the preliminary soil samples. The whole block is a contaminated dump. The cleanup costs would bankrupt anyone who didn't have a government grant to cover it. Good thing our friend at the EPA owes us a favor." She laughed, a short, ugly sound. It wasn't just about embezzlement. It wasn't just about bullying people out of their homes. It was a massive toxic conspiracy. They were forcing people out to sell the land to a developer who was going to get a federal grant to clean up a toxic waste problem that only they knew about. My phone buzzed again, a frantic, insistent vibration. My time was up. I had the ledger, but I had just stumbled into something 1,000 times worse. I ran. I didn't even think. I shoved the burner phone into my pocket, bolted from the office, and slipped out the back door just as I heard Clara's final, frantic text message buzz against my leg. "Get out now." I dove back into the bushes between our houses, my lungs burning, my mind reeling from what I had just heard. Toxic waste, a corrupt developer, a crooked official at the Environmental Protection Agency. This was a conspiracy that went far beyond our little neighborhood. Diane and Greg weren't just petty thieves. They were big-league criminals playing a very dangerous game. I made it back to my yard, my heart hammering against my ribs. The pigeon storm across the street was starting to die down as neighbors, bored of the spectacle, began to go back inside. The operation had been a success. I had the pictures of the ledger, but what I had overheard on that phone call changed everything. It recontextualized the entire fight. The tree, the fines, the harassment. It wasn't just about power and control. It was a systematic campaign to drive down property values and force people out, one by one, so they could sell a block of contaminated land to a developer who was in on the scheme. When I got inside, Clara was pacing in the living room, her face pale with worry. "Did you get it?" she whispered. "I got it," I said, my voice hoarse. "And a whole lot more." I played back the recording of the phone call I had managed to snag from the burner phone. As she listened, the color drained from her face. "Oh my God, Ethan," she breathed. This is huge. This is dangerous." "I know," I said. Then I told her the other part. "They're going after Silas next. He's their next target for foreclosure." Before Clara could even respond, there was a knock on our back door. We both froze. My first thought was that Greg had come home early, that he somehow knew. I cautiously peeked through the blinds. It was old man Silas, holding a covered dish. He looked completely calm, as if he hadn't just orchestrated a city-wide avian assault. I let him in. "That was quite a show, Silas," I said, my voice still shaky. "My boys like to perform," he said with a proud smile. He handed the dish to Clara. It was a freshly baked apple pie, a little something to celebrate a successful mission. "Did you get what you went for?" I looked at this eccentric old man, this retired pigeon fancier who had just helped me commit a felony, and I had to tell him the truth. "Silas, I said, my voice low and serious. We need to talk. I found the ledger, but I also found out that you're their next target. And I found out why. I told him everything I had heard on the phone call. I told him about the developer, the toxic land, the EPA connection. I expected him to be shocked or scared or angry. He was none of those things. He just listened intently, nodding slowly. When I was finished, he sat down at our dining room table, took a deep breath, and let out a long, weary sigh. I was afraid of that, he said quietly. I'd hoped it was just simple greed. Clara and I exchanged a confused look. You knew? Clara asked. You knew about the contamination? And then came the biggest twist of all, the one that made the world tilt on its axis. Old man Silas looked at us, and the folksy, eccentric old man persona melted away. His eyes were sharp, analytical, and tired. I didn't just know about it, he said. I'm the one who put it there. I stared at him, completely speechless. My name is not Silas, he said. It's Dr. Arthur Finch. I was a chemical engineer for a company that was shut down 30 years ago for illegal dumping. Before they went under, my boss ordered me to dispose of several barrels of highly toxic industrial solvent. I was young, scared, and stupid. I buried them right here on this land, long before this neighborhood was ever built. It was the biggest mistake of my life. He looked down at his hands. I've lived with that guilt every single day. I moved here under a new name to monitor the site, to make sure it never hurt anyone. I've been taking soil samples for decades. I knew Diane and her husband were crooks, and I've been gathering my own file on them for years. But I could never go to the authorities myself because it would mean confessing to my own crime. I was stuck. I've been waiting for someone, a catalyst, someone with the courage to stand up to them. Someone like you, Ethan. I couldn't speak. My mind was a whirlwind. Our quirky, comic relief neighbor wasn't a pigeon fancier. He was a fugitive scientist living a life of penance. The whole fight, the whole neighborhood, was sitting on a toxic secret. The ledger you photographed will put them away for fraud, he said, his voice filled with a new, hard resolve. But the recording of that phone call, combined with my testimony, that will put them in federal prison for the rest of their lives. It's time for me to pay for my mistakes, and it's time for them to pay for theirs. We had all the pieces, the financial fraud, the conspiracy, the confession. The HOA meeting was the next night. It was supposed to be our big moment of triumph. But now, knowing the truth, knowing the real stakes, it felt like we were arming ourselves for the final battle of a war we hadn't even known we were fighting. The question was no longer how to expose them. The question was, what would they do when they realized they were cornered for good? We had one night to prepare for the meeting that would change everything. The evidence was all there, loaded onto a secure flash drive. The photos of the ledger, the recording of Diane's phone call, and a signed, sworn statement from Dr. Arthur Finch, our old man Silas, confessing his own role and detailing the entire conspiracy. The plan was to present it all at the HOA meeting, a public forum where Diane couldn't hide. We would have other neighbors there as witnesses. It was supposed to be a neat, clean victory. But as darkness fell, a sense of deep unease settled over our house. These were not people who would go down quietly. Greg's threat against Clara echoed in my mind. They were desperate, and desperate people do desperate things. We should have a backup plan, Clara said, her voice tight with anxiety. She was standing at the window, peering through the blinds at Diane and Greg's house. The lights were on. They were home. They were probably planning their own response. What kind of backup plan? I asked. I don't know, she admitted. A go bag, a fire extinguisher, a trip to a hotel for the night. No, I said, my jaw set. We're not running. This is our home. We're defending it. Tonight. Right here. I spent the next hour walking through our house, thinking like an invader. I checked every lock on every window and door. I propped a chair under the knob of the back door. It felt flimsy, theatrical. I knew if Greg wanted to get in, a locked door wouldn't stop him. We needed an edge. My brain, which had been consumed with spreadsheets and bylaws, shifted gears. I wasn't an accountant anymore. I was a home defender. I found our old baby monitor, the kind with a video feed, and set it up pointing at our front door from the upstairs window. I placed a few empty glass bottles on the top step of the basement stairs, a makeshift alarm. I got a heavy-duty flashlight with a strobe function that could disorient someone in the dark. It all felt like something out of a movie, both ridiculous and deadly serious. Clara, catching on, put our dog's heavy water bowl just inside the kitchen door, a perfect tripping hazard in the dark. We were creating a fortress. Around 11 o'clock, it happened. The house went dark. The power was cut. Not just our house. The whole street went black. My heart leaped into my throat. This was it. They were making their move. The darkness was absolute, disorienting. The silence that followed was even worse. I grabbed the flashlight. Clara grabbed her phone to call 911. There was no signal. They must have used a jammer. They had thought of everything. We were isolated. We were on our own. We heard a noise from the back of the house, a scraping sound, then the sharp crack of splintering wood. He was breaking through the kitchen door. My plan with the chair had failed. Get upstairs, I whispered to Clara. Lock the bedroom door. Barricade it. She looked at me, her eyes wide with fear in the faint moonlight. What about you? I'll slow him down, I said. Just go. She ran up the stairs. I crept towards the kitchen, my heavy flashlight held like a club. I could hear him moving inside. He was being quiet, but the house was old and the floors creaked. He stepped into the kitchen. There was a loud clang, a curse, and a splash. He had kicked the dog's water bowl. Advantage, me. I flicked on the flashlight, hitting the strobe function. The kitchen exploded in a series of blinding, disorienting flashes. In the strobing light, I saw him. It was Greg, his face a mask of fury. He was momentarily blinded, shielding his eyes. Get out of my house. I yelled, my voice shaking but loud. He growled and lunged in my direction. He was swinging something heavy, a crowbar. I jumped back, and the crowbar smashed into the wall where my head had been, leaving a deep gash in the drywall. This was not a game. He was trying to kill me. He swung again. I dodged, retreating into the living room. He was between me and the stairs, between me and Clara. A wave of pure, protective fury washed over me. He would not get past me. Suddenly, a smell filled the air. Smoke, acrid and sharp. I glanced toward the garage. A faint orange glow was visible under the door. He hadn't just broken in to attack us. He had set a fire. He was trying to burn the house down, to destroy the evidence, to destroy us. The situation was dire, trapped with a fire starting and a man with a crowbar hunting me in the dark. But then I heard a faint sound from outside. Sirens, getting closer. Clara must have found a spot where the jammer didn't reach. Hope surged through me. I just had to hold on. Greg heard the sirens, too. He panicked. His plan was falling apart. He let out a roar of frustration and charged at me, swinging the crowbar wildly. I didn't run. I stood my ground. Just as he reached me, I dropped to the floor and stuck out my leg. It was a stupid, playground move, but in his blind rage, he didn't see it. He tripped, flying forward with a yell, and crashed headfirst into the heavy oak bookshelf against the wall. The shelf wobbled, then tipped, burying him under a cascade of books about history, gardening, and home repair. I scrambled to my feet, panting, as the flashing red and blue lights washed through our windows. Fire trucks and police cars were swarming our street. The showdown was over. I had won. But as I looked at the smoke pouring from my garage and the wreckage of my living room, I knew the battle for our quiet little neighborhood had come at a terrible price. The HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse the next night, but it felt less like a meeting and more like a crime scene debriefing. The room was packed. Word had spread like wildfire about the fire at our house, about Greg's arrest, about the army of police cars that had descended on our quiet street. For the first time, the neighbors weren't scared. They were angry. They were buzzing with questions and rumors. Clara and I walked in, and a hush fell over the room. We probably looked like ghosts. We were exhausted, bruised, and running on pure adrenaline. But we were there. We had made it. In the back of the room, 2 uniformed police officers stood, their presence a comforting and solid promise of order. Diane was at the front table. Of course, she was. She was trying to maintain her usual composure, but it was a fragile mask. Her eyes were puffy. Her perfect hair was slightly out of place. She looked like a queen whose castle was crumbling around her. She tried to start the meeting, to follow the usual script, but no one was listening. That's when I stood up. I didn't wait to be recognized. I just walked to the front of the room, holding the flash drive. There's only one item on the agenda tonight, Diane, I said, my voice ringing out in the silent room. And it's you. I plugged the drive into the projector that was usually used for boring slideshows about lawn maintenance. The first image that flashed up on the screen was a crystal-clear photo of a page from her secret ledger. The room gasped. I clicked through page after page, showing the proof of the stolen money, the fake invoices, the kickbacks. Then I played the audio. The recording of her phone call, her own voice, cold and cruel, filled the room, talking about the developer, the foreclosure, the toxic waste, the EPA official. People were shaking their heads in disbelief. The sheer scale of her evil was more than any of us had imagined. When the recording ended, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then a figure stepped forward from the crowd. It was Old Man Silas, Dr. Arthur Finch. He was no longer in his fishing hat and mismatched socks. He was wearing a simple, neat suit. He looked dignified and profoundly sad. "My name is Arthur Finch," he said, his voice steady. "And what he says is true. I have given my full confession to the police. The crimes committed by Diane and Greg Fitzgerald are not just against this community. They are federal offenses." That's when the two officers moved. They walked to the front of the room, their faces grim. Diane stood up, her face white with shock and fury. "This is slander. These are lies," she shrieked. But it was too late. The dam of fear had broken. One by one, other neighbors began to stand up to speak out. Mr. Peterson, his voice trembling with rage, spoke about the years of financial abuse. The young couple across the street talked about the harassment that forced them to destroy their garden. A dozen voices joined in, a chorus of the wronged, finally free to speak their truth. As the stories poured out, one of the officers calmly placed a hand on Diane's arm. "Ma'am," he said, his voice polite but firm, "you need to come with us." And just like that, the queen was dethroned. They led her out of the clubhouse, her face a mask of disbelief. The reign of terror was over. The aftermath was swift. Diane and Greg faced a mountain of charges, from embezzlement and fraud to assault, arson, and conspiracy. With Dr. Finch's testimony, the EPA official and the developer were also indicted. The full weight of the law came down on them. Their assets were seized to pay back the HOA and to fund the environmental cleanup of the land they had tried to steal. Our little neighborhood began to heal. A new board was elected, one based on transparency and respect. The ridiculous rules were abolished. The Websters rebuilt their swing set in a bright, defiant red. The rose garden across the street was replanted. Our oak tree stood tall and proud. A few weeks later, Clara and I were sitting on our back deck. The house was repaired. The peace we had moved here for had finally, truly returned. Old Man Silas, who was given immunity for his testimony, came over with an apple pie. We sat together, the three of us, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "You know," I said, taking a bite of pie, "I think I might get another Flamingo." Clara laughed, a real, happy laugh. "Don't you dare," she said. I looked at my wife, my friend, and my home. And I knew the answer to that question that had haunted me. How far will a man go to defend his own? As far as it takes. All the way to the end of the line. Because some things, peace, family, and the right to a ridiculous plastic bird on your lawn are always worth fighting for.